I'd always known the arrogance of the Cathari, a warrior species, proud and mighty, standing at the apex of combat across the known galaxy. But I had never seen it embodied so completely as in her, Commander Zalara of the Crimson Claw. She stood before me, tall and imposing, her emerald-scaled body shimmering under the pale light of Varthis Prime's twin moons. Even at rest, she was coiled with power, every muscle primed for combat. Her kind evolved to be perfect predators, lean, strong, and terrifyingly fast. I had seen the Cathari in battle before, tearing through lesser species like they were. Made of paper, their reputation was deserved. But I wasn't like the others. You are the one they call Captain Steel. Zalara's voice was laced with disdain, her slit-pupiled eyes scanning me with barely concealed amusement. I was expecting someone bigger. The other Cathari warriors standing behind her laughed, their hissing voices grating against my ears. They were massive creatures, each one built like a war machine. Standing amongst them, I must have looked small, insignificant, weak. That was their first mistake. I rolled my shoulders, the combat suit humming as it adjusted to my movement. And I was expecting someone smarter, I said casually, tilting my head. Looks like we're both disappointed. The laughter died. Zalara's eyes flashed with something dangerous. Her lips curled upward, revealing sharp fangs. A smile, a challenge. Maybe both. You think yourself my equal human? She stepped forward, her massive frame towering over me. Do you honestly believe you can stand against a Cathari in single combat? I could snap you in half before you even... I raised a hand, cutting her off. Yeah, I've heard it all before. I tapped the console on my wrist, activating the official Duel protocol. A sharp beep confirmed my challenge had been registered. A crimson symbol flared to life on my forearm, marking the combat as sanctioned by both parties. Less talking, more fighting. Zalara's gaze flicked to the symbol, then back to me. For a moment, I saw something almost resembling intrigue in her eyes. The Cathari were not just warriors, they were warriors bound by honor. Once a challenge was issued, it could not be refused. There was no turning back now. You have courage, she admitted, though her tone was still condescending. A foolish trait when it leads you to certain death. I smirked. You'll find humans have a habit of surviving certain death. A murmur rippled through the gathered Cathari. They weren't used to this. Humans were supposed to be diplomats, traders, scientists, not warriors. I saw the way they watched me now, some amused, others intrigued, a few wary. Zalara tilted her head, then slowly raised her clawed hand. Then let us see if your species truly deserves its place among warriors. Her claws gleamed under the moonlight as she clenched her fist. I accept. The Cathari took their duel seriously. This was no back-alley brawl, no casual skirmish, to be broken up by bystanders. Once the challenge was accepted, it became a sacred rite. The battlefield was prepared within minutes, a testament to their efficiency and their eagerness to see blood spilled. I stood in the center of the ceremonial arena, a vast circular platform of polished black stone, surrounded by towering spires etched with ancient symbols. The ground beneath my feet was smooth but worn, bearing the scars of countless battles fought before mine. Above us, the twin moons of Varthis Prime hung heavy in the night sky, casting an eerie silver glow over the assembled crowd. Thousands of Cathari filled the viewing terraces, their emerald-scaled bodies shifting in anticipation. Their voices rumbled like a storm, speaking in their native tongue, no doubt exchanging bets, speculating on how long I would last before Zalara ended me. I could feel their eyes on me, assessing, judging. To them, I was nothing but a curiosity, a human foolish enough to challenge one of their greatest warriors. Zalara entered the arena with the confidence of a predator that had never lost. Her crimson combat armor was adorned with ceremonial markings, each one representing a past victory, a fallen opponent. There were many. She stood at the far end of the platform, rolling her shoulders as she stretched, completely unconcerned. She didn't even bother drawing her weapons. The plasma blades strapped to her back remained untouched, as if they weren't even necessary. No, she intended to finish this with her bare hands. Her confidence was infuriating. A deep drum beat echoed through the arena, signaling the beginning of the duel. The Cathari did not believe in countdowns or drawn-out formalities. The moment the drums began, the fight was on. Solara tilted her head, her sharp pupils narrowing as she studied me. Last chance to yield, human. There is no shame in knowing your limits. I tightened my grip on my combat knife, the blade gleaming under the moonlight. That's funny. I was about to say the same thing to you. A flicker of amusement crossed her face. Then, in the blink of an eye, she moved. I barely saw it. Just a blur of emerald scales and raw muscle. One moment she was standing in front of me, the next she was at my side, her claws slicing toward my ribs. I twisted, just barely avoiding the strike, feeling the air split beside me. The force of her movement sent a gust of wind against my face. The crowd roared in approval, thrilled by her speed. I rolled away, heart pounding. She was fast. Faster than anything I had ever fought before. If I hadn't reacted in time, her strike might have ended the fight before it even began. Solara tilted her head, watching me closely. Not bad, she mused. You're still alive. I exhaled slowly, adjusting my stance. This was going to be interesting. She came at me again, and this time I barely managed to react. Her speed was unreal. A blur of emerald scales. She closed the distance in a heartbeat, her claws cutting through the air with deadly precision. I twisted my body just in time, feeling the whisper of her strike as it missed my throat by mere inches. The sheer force of her movement sent a rush of wind past my face, and I knew if she had connected, I'd be dead. I barely had time to plant my feet before she struck again. A sweeping kick aimed to knock me off balance. I jumped back, avoiding it by the narrowest margin. But she didn't stop. Her momentum carried her forward, and suddenly her other leg was coming up in a brutal follow-up, aiming straight for my ribs. I raised my arms just in time. Her shin collided with my forearms, and even through my combat suit, the impact rattled my bones. I staggered back, gritting my teeth. Damn, she hit hard. The crowd erupted in laughter and cheers, their hissing voices echoing through the arena. To them, this was entertainment. A human struggling to survive against one of their greatest warriors. Solara stepped back, rolling her shoulders, her expression one of complete ease. She wasn't even winded. "Is that all?" she taunted, flexing her claws. "I expected more." I exhaled, shaking out my arms. The sting from that last kick lingered, but pain was something I had learned to live with. I had been in worse situations. And more importantly, I was still standing. "You talk too much," I muttered. Her eyes gleamed. "Then let's see if you can shut me up." She lunged, a flash of movement that would have been impossible to track if I hadn't been watching closely. But this time I was ready. I sidestepped at the last moment, feeling her claws graze past my shoulder. As she overextended, I pivoted and brought my knife up in a tight arc, aiming for the exposed section between her armor plates. She twisted at the last second. My blade met resistance but didn't sink in deep, just a shallow cut along her side. The crowd went silent for a heartbeat. Solara jumped back, looking down at the thin line of blood trickling from her scales. Then, to my surprise, she let out a short laugh. "You drew blood," she mused. "That hasn't happened in a long time." I didn't respond. I simply reset my stance, my grip on my knife tightening. She grinned, baring sharp teeth. Good. I was worried this would be boring. Then she moved faster than before. I barely had time to register her coming before she was on me again, her claws striking in a relentless flurry. My knife flashed, parrying some, dodging others, but she was overwhelming. And then pain. A sharp, burning sensation tore across my shoulder as her claws finally found their mark. Blood sprayed into the air. The crowd roared in approval. Zalara stepped back, licking the blood from her fingertips. "You're fast," she admitted, "but not fast enough." I ignored the pain, rolling my shoulder. The wound wasn't deep. It just meant one thing. She was testing me. I wiped the blood from my arm and met her gaze. "We'll see." She came at me again, pressing the attack without hesitation. Claws slashed through the air, each strike aimed with the precision of a seasoned warrior. She wasn't just fast. She was calculated, relentless, and utterly confident. In her victory, I dodged left, then right, barely staying ahead of her movements. My combat suit enhanced my reaction time, but even with that edge, I was struggling. Every move I made felt like a fraction of a second too slow. She was pushing me, testing my limits, waiting for the inevitable moment when I made a mistake, and I would. If I kept fighting like this, if I kept reacting instead of controlling the flow of battle, I would lose. I needed to adapt. Zalara lunged, claws swiping for my chest. Instead of pulling away, I stepped into her attack. It was a gamble, but one I had to take. The moment her arm extended, I twisted my body, angling just enough that her claws grazed my armor rather than digging into flesh. At the same time, I slammed my elbow into her exposed ribs, putting every ounce of strength I had into the strike. She grunted, surprised. It wasn't enough to do real damage, but it disrupted her rhythm. I pressed the advantage. My knife flashed. As I slashed at her side, she twisted, avoiding a deep cut, but the blade still met flesh. Another thin red line appeared across her scales. The crowd let out a collective hiss. The atmosphere in the arena shifted, their amusement fading into something more uncertain. Zalara's gaze flicked to the wound, then back to me. Her expression was unreadable, but I could see it now, the first traces of irritation. "Good." She attacked again, but I was already moving. She expected me to retreat, to evade, but I did the opposite. I stepped in close, into her guard, where her speed wouldn't matter as much. She swiped at me, but the angle was awkward, the movement less fluid. I ducked under her arm and drove. My knee into her abdomen. Her body barely moved from the impact, but I felt her tense. I wasn't going to beat her with strength. I wasn't going to beat her with speed. But humans had something other species underestimated. We learned. I was reading her now, tracking the subtle shifts in her stance, the way her muscles twitched before a strike. Every movement had a rhythm, a pattern. She was fast, yes, but she relied on instinct and natural ability. I could use that against her. She came at me again, and this time I was ready. Her claws flashed toward my face. I ducked. She adjusted, pivoting to swipe at my side. I twisted, her attack grazing my armor. In that split second, I stepped into her blind spot and brought my knife down in a sharp arc. She barely dodged, my blade cutting a shallow gash across her arm. Her eyes flared with something new. Not anger, not amusement, realization. For the first time, she understood this wasn't going to be an easy victory. Zalara exhaled slowly, rolling her shoulders as she studied me. The confidence was still there, but the amusement had faded. What replaced it was something more dangerous. Focus. She was no longer toying with me. Good. She moved again, but this time she wasn't relying solely on speed. She adjusted, her stance tighter, her attacks more precise. She was adapting. So was I. Her clawed hand lashed out in a brutal arc, aiming for my throat. I ducked, sidestepping just enough that the tip of her claws scraped the air where my neck had been a fraction of a second earlier. Before she could recover, I countered, driving my fist into her side. It connected, but she barely reacted. Her body was built for war, her muscles like steel cables beneath her emerald scales. Still, it was enough to disrupt her flow. She retaliated instantly, bringing her knee up toward my ribs. I twisted, blocking, with my forearm, but the force sent me skidding backward. Pain flared up my arm, and I gritted my teeth. The crowd roared at the exchange. Their cheers had changed. Less mocking, more invested. This wasn't just a slaughter anymore. It was a fight. Zalara wiped the thin streak of blood from her arm. Her golden eyes locked onto mine. "You learn quickly," she admitted. I smirked, despite the dull ache in my side. "Humans are good at that." She chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "So I see." Then she moved differently. There was no warning, no build-up, just pure aggression. She closed the distance with a sudden burst of speed faster than before. I had adjusted to her rhythm, but now she was shifting it, throwing off my timing. I barely got my knife up before she was on me. Her hand lashed out, not with claws this time, but with a brutal palm strike that slammed into my chest. The impact sent me staggering backward, my boots skidding against the arena floor. She didn't stop. The moment I regained my footing, she was already attacking again. A kick, high and fast, aimed at my head. I ducked, but she adjusted mid-motion, twisting her body and using the momentum to spin into a second kick. I had no time to dodge. Her heel crashed against my shoulder, and I hit the ground hard. Pain flared through my body. My vision blurred for a second, and I tasted blood in my mouth. The crowd erupted, their cheers deafening. Zalara stepped back, flexing her hands. "You are skilled," she said, her voice calm. "But you cannot match me." I pushed myself up, rolling my shoulder. It hurt, but nothing was broken. "Maybe not," I admitted, wiping the blood from my lip. Then I grinned. "But I can make you work for it." Zalara's eyes gleamed with something new. Respect. And then, for the first time, she nodded. "Good." Zalara came at me again, but this time something had changed. There was no mockery in her strikes, no arrogance in her movements. She fought with precision, with discipline. Gone was the predator toying with her prey. Now she was treating me as a true opponent. I barely had time to react before she was in my space, claws flashing in the moonlight. I twisted, ducking under a vicious swipe aimed at my neck. My knife came up in a tight arc, but she deflected it with her forearm, the force of her block sending a jolt through my wrist. She was stronger, faster, but I had something she didn't. She was fighting by instinct, by centuries of honed natural ability. But humans, we didn't just survive. We adapted. I changed my tactics. Instead of trying to match her speed, I used it against her. When she lunged, I sidestepped, forcing her momentum to work in my favor. When she overextended, I struck, not to do damage, but to disrupt her balance. Little by little, the fight shifted. Zalara noticed. Her expression remained composed, but I saw the flicker of realization in her golden eyes. This was no longer the easy victory she had expected. She pivoted, coming at me with a low sweep of her leg. I jumped, narrowly avoiding it, only to realize too late it was a feint. She followed up instantly, twisting into an upward slash with her claws. I barely dodged, but her talons still grazed my side, tearing through my combat suit and raking across my ribs. Pain flared, sharp and hot, but I didn't have time to process. She pressed the attack, forcing me back with a relentless barrage of strikes. I gritted my teeth, focusing. I had to find an opening. Then I saw it. She swung at me with her right arm, a powerful sweeping strike meant to finish the fight. But for the first time, she wasn't as fast as before. The prolonged battle was starting to wear on her, just slightly, but enough. I ducked under the swing and stepped in. Instead of retreating, I used my momentum to slam my shoulder into her midsection. She stumbled just for a fraction of a second. But a fraction of a second was all I needed. I drove my knife forward, aiming for the soft space beneath her ribs. Zalara twisted at the last moment, avoiding a fatal strike, but my blade still found flesh. She let out a sharp hiss as steel cut into her side, a deeper wound than before. The crowd went silent. For the first time, Zalara staggered back, clutching. A wound, blood dripped onto the arena floor. She looked down at it, then at me. And then she smiled, a slow, sharp grin. She straightened, rolling her shoulders. "Good," she said, her voice laced with something new. "Now, let's see what you really have." And then she charged. Zalara surged forward, faster than before, her golden eyes blazing with something raw and unrestrained. She wasn't holding back anymore. I barely had time to react before she was on me. Her first strike was a downward slash aimed straight for my chest. I dodged left, twisting my body to avoid the blow, but she adjusted mid-motion, her knee rocketing toward my ribs. I braced myself, absorbing the hit as best I could. Pain exploded through my side, but I didn't let it slow me. I caught her arm, as she withdrew, using her own momentum to pull her off balance. For a split second, she was open. I drove my knife forward. She twisted, just barely dodging the full force of my strike. My blade glanced off her armor, cutting another shallow line across her scales. Not enough. She retaliated instantly, her elbow slamming into my jaw. My vision blurred and the metallic taste of blood filled my mouth. The force of the hit sent me stumbling, but I forced myself to stay upright. The crowd had fallen silent now. They had expected a spectacle, a brutal, one-sided fight where their champion crushed the human challenger. But this was something else entirely. Zalara exhaled sharply, her breath heavy but steady. She wiped at the fresh cut on her side, inspecting the blood that smeared her fingers. Then she grinned. "You're still standing," she said, almost in disbelief. "Most would have fallen by now." I spat blood onto the ground and met her gaze. "I'm not most," she let out a low chuckle. "No, you're not." Then she lunged again, but this time I didn't dodge. I stepped into her attack, throwing every ounce of my strength into a forward charge. The sudden move caught her off guard. She had expected me to evade, to keep trying to outmaneuver her. Instead, I met her head-on. Her claws slashed across my shoulder, but I ignored the pain. My knife struck first, sinking deep into the side of her torso. She gasped, her body tensing. For the first time, her movements faltered. I twisted the blade and drove my other fist into her gut. She staggered. For a split second, she was vulnerable. I could have finished it. One more strike, one more well-placed. Stab, and the duel would be over, but I didn't. Instead, I stepped back. Zalara clutched her wound, breathing heavily. She looked at me, truly looked at me, and something shifted in her expression. Not just respect, something deeper. Understanding. She exhaled slowly, then let out a sharp, barking laugh. Then, to the shock of the entire arena, she dropped to one knee, a sign of surrender. The crowd erupted in chaos, but I didn't hear them. I just met Zalara's gaze as she spoke. "You win, human." And in that moment I knew. She had never truly thought of me as weak. She had just needed to be proven wrong.